And because this is a topic which has been much discussed, and it has been a fascinating topic for many people, including philosophers, politicians, sociologists, and so on. So I'm assuming that all of you are here in front of my screen, and I am there in front of your screen because you are interested to listen to this talk, and not because you want to avoid something and you want to be detached from something, because this whole topic is about detachment, which comes mostly in a negative manner, which I will be discussing throughout. So I want to repeat once again, because I see about 42 people for attending this class, but then I think there are a few people who are still not. Okay, so some people I think are writing that because of your bandwidth. Yeah, I really appreciate if it is a bandwidth issue, you just send it through the chat box so that we don't worry, and you also don't worry, and we understand the situation. But if it's not of a bandwidth, I think you should perhaps not be part of this meeting, but enjoy the rain just is going on outside so beautifully. Well, yesterday's lecture by Dr. Naren Rao was about the distanced self, right? And he mostly explained in a very technical manner the implications of distancing oneself, and perhaps the outcomes of distancing, and also the causes of distancing. I want to talk to you about one phenomenon which you and I would have gone through at some point in our life. And let me say that from the speaker's side as well as the listener's side, I think it will be tough to say that we haven't experienced what is called as alienation. Because sometimes alienation becomes the very cause of living and to look for something else. So the encouragement to live life in a different manner, or in a manner which you think you can be different, comes because of this whole phenomenon called alienation. So let me try to share with you what this phenomenon is and what it does to us and what happens during the process of alienation. Because I think it's indeed very important that we understand, by looking inward to a particular phenomenon, which is very deep and intimate and therefore cannot be extricated. Alienation is such a phenomenon. At times we don't even know that we experience the experience called phenomenon. And let me try to explain to you some of the intricacies which are involved in the experience of alienation. First of all, alienation it's a composite of attitudes, composite of value systems, composite of dispositions, and so on. But in common parlance, alienation means it's primarily a condition, an existential condition, a psychological condition of being isolated, of isolation, division, and desertion. So you feel isolated, you feel divided between what, we will come to that very soon, and also perhaps abandonment, a desertion. Deserted by what is, of course, an important question. Perhaps deserted by the society, deserted by the environment, and most importantly, deserted by one's own self. And that is why alienation is a very powerful psychological phenomenon. And we have to understand what it involves, particularly in the context of COVID-19, because there were several reasons for many of us, or almost all of us, to feel alienated, at least to some degrees. And the experience of alienation brings to us similar experience of being avoided and excluded. Who would want to be avoided? Who would want to be excluded in a company? Let's say we three people are standing together and the first person takes the second person with him and walks forward and leaves you behind. What would your feeling be? You feel excluded, you feel abandoned. So the sense of abandonment is very huge in alienation. But let us look into some of the other theoretical ideas also about alienation before we come to the more psychological and philosophical attributes of this. Many of you, and if you are particularly studied social sciences, humanities, and political science, you know that the concept of alienation is also very much rooted in socio-political processes. Many think that alienation is the outcome of socio-political processes. And this has been demonstrated to us in the most powerful manner and in the most emphatic manner by none other than Karl Marx. And I don't have to talk about this, but you know that according to the Marxian theory, alienation is a socio-political outcome of processes or an impact of processes of industrialization and social reorganization. And the forces that bring in social reorganization and industrialization are the forces of capitalism and modernization. So people feel left out. People do not feel carried to the next stage of modernity in such a context. And this has been very nicely, intricately, and detailed in a detailed manner demonstrated by Marx. Of course, whether it is successful, such a theory is successful today, that's a different question. But it is very important for us to also know that alienation also has its roots in socio-political processes, and the experience of alienation, particularly the alienation of the society, because you might ask, who is alienated? Is the self alienated or a society is alienated? Many people think that it is not the self which is alienated, it is the society itself is alienated. But to understand such very complex process of a bidirectional process of alienating each other, of the individual from the society and the society from the individual, we also need to understand that there are political, socio-political forces which work behind it and which are also compartmentalizing between the haves and have-nots in a continuous manner. And we see that phenomenon even today. And I think perhaps it was very starkly visible in the times of COVID-19, of the haves and the have-nots. Who has the medicine? Who doesn't have the medicine? Who has at least the hope for a medicine? Who doesn't have even a hope for the medicine? Who has a home? Who didn't have a home? Who had food? Who didn't have food? Who had long walks to do? Who had no walks to do, but already settled at their homes? We saw the migrant laborers walking miles and miles. And whenever I think of COVID-19, that's the picture which comes to my mind. So we cannot forget those people who had very strong legs and those people whose legs were immobile because they were settled in a very comfortable home. So definitely we know that the forces of industrialization, the forces of market economy, forces of distributing resources which are scarce have impacted upon the lives of people in a very strong manner. And we saw several sceneries and scenes of this during the last 2 months, and we are continuing to see that. And before Marx, there are also people like Rousseau and Hegel who perhaps indicated the idea of alienation. And Hegel, through the dialectical method of how the parts of a whole come together by challenging each other, and the whole process of integration also involving perhaps process of some amount of exclusion, because any amount of inclusion also has to exclude. Well, these are more complex political theories. We don't want to perhaps go deep into that, because today I think our focus will be on the psychological processes and perhaps the existential phenomenon called alienation. And from that point of view, you can say that alienation is a subjective condition. And however much it has been influenced by the socio-political processes, the market economy and so on, the capitalist forces, it's also a subjective condition. We cannot deny that. And whether such a subjective condition has been the result of the market forces, the socio-political forces, is a different question, and it may need several hours of discussion, and still we may not find an answer. But I think some amount of clarity which we can have about the alienation is by analyzing alienation from a psychological point of view, from a subjective point of view, and from a philosophical point of view. In the modern world, perhaps none other than Erich Fromm brought in the idea of alienation in a very fascinating manner. Erich Fromm presented alienation as a subjective condition, as a personal existential disposition. And primarily, alienation is to feel alienated, which means the first part of this word itself, which is alien. What's the meaning of alien? To be alien. Alien is a foreigner. You don't know about him or her. You have not met him or her. You wouldn't know how an alien would relate to you and how you can relate to an alien. So it is a heightened sense of lack of familiarity with the person or with the environment you are interacting with. And because of this lack of connect, you feel miserable, and you also experience suffering in a very powerful manner. And it's very interesting that often when we talk about alienation, we talk about being estranged. If you look at some of these papers and texts on alienation, you would see that an immediate meaning which comes for alienation is to feel strange or is to feel estranged. So estrangement is actually a continuation of meeting a stranger, or to feel strange enough. You feel yourself as strange, as a stranger, and you also feel the person or the environment with which you interact as strange and as a stranger. And I think this is very, very important. The idea of familiarity is so important for us to connect with oneself and with the other. So alienation breaks that healthy divide of the self and the other and brings in a big wall between the two, a very ice-cold wall. Sometimes we talk about people in our life. He is so cold. She is so cold. I've been talking since morning, but he doesn't hear anything. Or, of course, I'm using he or she, but this can go either way. And you also make the expression, I think he's a wall. Nothing goes through him, right? He makes this expression, nothing goes through him, or nothing touches him, or nothing touches her. Because you feel a strong sense of lack of familiarity. You're unable to relate with the person in the context of familiarity. And this can happen between people who have known for, let us say, 50, 60 years, or it can happen between people who have known for perhaps just 2 months. So it's not a phenomenon which comes only much later, or it's not a phenomenon which comes just after 2 months. It is a lifelong process. A lifelong process which is experienced whenever you lack familiarity with the person or with the environment you are relating. So familiarity becomes a very, very important conjuncture or a condition for us to live meaningfully. We need to be familiar with the environment which we relate to, and also we need to be familiar with the people with whom we relate to. And if we are not familiar with the people we relate to, our culture and society has given us certain frameworks how to deal with the lack of familiarity, the unfamiliar. So we deal, I'm putting the word deal because deal is it's a little gross word according to me, but then at this point we have to use that. We have to deal with the people and the environment with which we are not familiar by the structures of society, by the exercises society has taught us, the state teaches us, and the enforcement bodies tells us. So we have the police system and also neighborhoods with walls and homes with walls, and also people with cold faces, people with warm faces, but stopped with a hello and a hi. So there are several layers of unfamiliarity in our own personality with which we deal in a day-to-day life. And so what I wanted to say is that familiarity becomes so important for us to feel healthy enough or for us to feel connected. So when familiarity deteriorates to an alarming degree, then you feel a stranger to yourself and a stranger to the environment or the outside world. And please remember the meaning of stranger. I would like you to go through that, the example of stranger or the possibility of something which is strange as we discuss this, because that's when we can understand what is it to be estranged, what is it to be alienated, how to respond to a life which largely feels like a strange person. So you are with your life, and how about your life looking at you as a strange person? How comfortable will you be? You will not be. We will not be comfortable. So this is the power of alienation, and it cuts across the very possibility of having any meaning in life. And psychology talks about it in a very, very elaborate manner. And for philosophy also, I think it is a very, very important concept. Now, I want to go through a little bit more about alienation, what we go through in the process of alienation. Because once we unravel through words, we are also visualizing this phenomenon perhaps in an objective manner. And that I think is very important as co-learners, people sitting together like this in a digital space. In alienation, there is also a sense of feeling overpowered by the powerful. And the powerful can be a political force. It can be a force of patriarchy. It can be a force of extreme emotions. It can be a force of extreme concern. It can be a force of being uncomfortable with oneself. So please remember that when you say the sense of being overpowered, the one who overpowers you not necessarily always have to be a force of patriarchy or a manipulative agent. He or she or that agent can also be a source of love, can be a source of concern. That is why you also sometimes see in family relationships that children become overpowered by parents, parents become overpowered by children, and that is not because of any desire to control or any outcome of manipulation or any sense of patriarchy, but it is a positive need to be concerned about oneself. It's a positive need to be awareful of what the other person goes through. But then somehow they also become agents of overpowering the other. And whenever we overpower the other, either through positive emotions or through negative structures or forces such as patriarchy, we are denying that person to have a self, that person to have an agency in her or herself. Because you and I know that to be overpowered by something, let's take the example of COVID-19 itself. We were all overpowered by the state, right? However much liberal and however much free person, carefree you are, we were overpowered by the state, we were overpowered by the police. The other day, as I was driving, and I think it was the third car in front of me, I suddenly saw the driver being stopped, the person being stopped. And then when I looked sideways, I saw a policeman stopping him. And then I also saw the person who is driving suddenly taking the mask from the seat adjacent and wearing it. So the question was, in a car, are you expected to wear a mask? I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. So what was the policeman expecting him to do? Or why would the policeman think that this person doesn't have the intelligence or the obedience to respect the rules of the health institutions or the state to wear a mask when you are in the company of perhaps two people? So, and it was very interesting that how immediately the driver took his hand to the other side, and which was the mask which was safely there, and started wearing it. And I guess, and the policeman definitely was busy writing, and he was not interested that he were wearing a mask immediately. And I'm sure he was giving him a chit for, I don't know, what's the fine, 500, I guess. So look at the power of overpowering. And this is a small example. But when you look back, a flashback of 2 months, and I think in people in Delhi or other states like Tamil Nadu, people are still undergoing very strict measures of containment. They know what they are going through, what we are talking about now. So when we are not allowed to get out of your house, first because of a state instruction, and then our own self telling us, oh, please obey these gods, please obey these powers, because they know what is truth. So the agents of overpowering become beholders of truth and beholders of reality. So we are pushed to a world, a neither world of ideality and of dream, but being controlled by the powers who know what is real. So in fact, we give the ownership to those powers to decide what is real. Of course, what I'm saying definitely is philosophically loaded, but I think we have all experientially understood what is it to be overpowered. And in the case of lockdown experience, being overpowered was the most easily available thing for all of us, right? All of us felt the experience of being overpowered. Of course, outside your home, overpowered by the state machinery, the health institutions, and so on. Inside the house, overpowered by your spouse, your children, your servant, if at all a servant was there, or your children. You cannot walk up to there, you cannot walk like this, you cannot look outside the window, or you cannot talk to people over the phone for more than, whatever time. So there was this overpowering, the contagion of overpowering also which was happening. So it was not only the contagion of the virus, but it was also the contagion of overpowering and being overpowered. And what is interesting is that while the media and information sources talked about a pandemic, which was spreading in the form of a strain of virus, nobody talked about the contagion of being overpowered. So the state overpowered us and we overpowered people at home. So we suddenly had new routines, so you may have to clean your floor, the other person will have to cook, or sometimes we don't know. I mean, I don't have to explain because I'm sure all of you know what was happening in our homes and how did we divide the labor and work going on and who decided whom should be doing what. Because that can be done only by the most powerful person in that house, right? So the sense of overpowering was very pervasive, and it was also very subtle. And that is, I think, which is very interesting. Most of the time, the way you overpower may not be felt as overpowering by yourself. You might say that, oh, I never overpower anyone. In fact, I'm so aware of the, the negative side of overpowering one. But then we don't know. Whenever we have the have, whenever we have the people who have, we will overpower the people who are have-nots. And that's not a political theory. That is the very fact of life. And the haves can be in the form of things. The haves can be in the form of emotions. The haves can be in the form of concern and love for another person. So this is the thickness of what we call as alienation, which is caused to a great extent by overpowering. So to feel overpowered by the powerful. So already there's a distinction of being overpowered and seeing or interacting with someone or something which is powerful. Between someone who is overpowered and who is powerful, an equal relationship is possible, equal give and take is possible. I don't know. That has to be again thought about, because equality we talk about when in terms of dialoguing of possibilities and life situations. As a result of being overpowered, you also won't get enough occasions to express oneself. You lose your agency in a progressive manner. And as a result, we feel isolated. Isolated first from what is happening, isolated from the possibility of having decisive power, isolated from the possibility of finding meanings for oneself, and isolated, most importantly, from being an agent for oneself and in a context. And as a result of isolation, and again, let's remember that we all went through this in the last 2 months of being isolated, and as a global phenomenon of social isolation, we all went through that. And then as a result of this, we feel disconnected with what was happening outside the realm of the life which we live. And it's interesting to look at the whole meaning of what is to be disconnected. Again, these are words which we use in a very frequent manner in our life, isn't it? That we always or once in a while say, oh, I feel disconnected. I don't have a connect with the other person, right? You say that, oh, I really wish to have a connect, but then I'm unable to create a connect, or I'm unable to feel a connect. So connect is a very, what should I say? It's a very tangible phenomenon in flesh and blood. It's not just though it might think it's like a mechanical unit of connecting. It's not a mechanical entity. It's actually a connect between hearts. It's actually a connect between something which is much more deeper. So the first level of disconnect happens with the other. And the other, again, Dr. Naren talked about it yesterday, and I think we discussed about the other in the first class too. Because any healthy existence begins with a moderately available degree of self and other divide. We know what is the self, and we know what is the other. The self of oneself and the other, which is outside the self, or which is other than the self. So the first disconnect is from the self and the other. And what is this other? We will see. For different people, the other is constituted by different things. And for some people, it can be very layered. For some people, it can be very, very complex. So what is the disconnect? The disconnect can be from our work, activities, and outcomes. So a disconnect from what you do in your daily life, your actions, and outcomes. You no more feel interested in your activities, you no more feel interested or curious to think about the outcomes of your activities. Because what I'm just saying now is a very, very important guideline for us to lead a healthy life, which is a connect which we have between our actions and the outcomes we can think about it. And in common parlance, again, people talk about consequential thinking. That in an action which we engage with also tells us to some degree what would be the consequences of it. But if you are unable to see the consequences or the results and outcomes of our action to a great degree, then we are also perhaps not seeing our own ability to do such an action. So that means you're already disconnected with the action, that it doesn't even tell you the possible outcomes of that action, even to a small degree. And of course, the disconnect from the near and the dear ones, your family and your immediate environment, your people whom you call as your near and dear ones, a disconnect from them. Of course, sometimes we lead a very long life, disconnected from the near and dear ones, right? Well, we all have a story to tell to each of us. We don't have to talk about that story to another person, but we know about it. We lead long lives, but in a disconnected manner, in a disconnected framework with the other. And most of the time, the other is that person who lives with us for most of our life. And that can be your parents, your spouse, your partners, your children, and so on. And such an estrangement, such a disconnect finally brings in a disconnect from oneself. And this is I think, the most difficult part, the disconnect from oneself. Because even if you disconnect with the rest of the entities around you, perhaps there is some possibility. But once the disconnect happens with your own self, then you no more have curiosity, you no more have a desire to know, you no more have a need to have emotions, you no more have a desire to share emotions. So you become a very bland and a blank person. Well, sometimes blandness is nice, but at times being bland puts off the other person very much. Again, there are common parlances which we use. Don't be so bland, right? Have some spice in your life. We use these phrases, which means we are unable to relate with that person, or we are unable to relate with what we are facing. So the finality of the disconnect is disconnecting from oneself. And once you disconnect from oneself, your ability to be an agent, your ability to own what you have engaged with lessens and lessens. It becomes lesser and lesser. And it is at that time you start disowning. You disown your possibility of being an agent. Disown the possibility of you having the capacity to do things. And please remember, these are phenomena which happen in our life. When people overpower us to a great degree, we lose our ability to be an agent. We disown our agency and we become just forces of, I don't think we can even describe as forces. We become actually products of these forces. We just become dolls which are controlled by the strings which are up above. We become part of the shadow games. So this is what happens in alienation at a greater degree when you disconnect from your own self, you disown your agency and authorship. And our sense of self then becomes very indistinct, not clear. We don't know to whom we are talking to. We don't know who we are, because the process of alienation is so strong that it diminishes the shape and name of the self we all have. So there is an indistinct sense of self which gradually grows in us. The word grow, I know that it is a It is an oxymoron now because it is not growth. It's the shrinking of a self. But finally, a disownment of oneself leads one to separate from oneself. And such a separation from oneself gives us no interest in day-to-day life routines such as eating, sleeping, etc. And this is something again which happened to us during the COVID-19 time. Though some people were very, very interested in cooking and having experiments done in the kitchen, after some point, people started feeling, what am I doing? You know, they lose their idea, they lose their recipe, interest in looking for a recipe. And people who were cleaning their houses continuously for so many days as part of their routine felt cleaning is such a boring thing to do. So the very routines perhaps you started enjoying in the beginning gave a lot of boredom for you. So you started separating yourself from the actions you engage with. And such a separation also gives a separation from commitment. Commitment to something which is deeper, commitment to something which holds us together along with the other person. And we started seeing disconnectedness between the order of events and people. So we didn't know in what way things were going on in our life. There was a disconnect of events and people. Now, why I think it's important to talk about the COVID-19 when we discuss the alienated self is because the COVID-19 perhaps was the best psychological experiment to understand alienation as a power of not only the socio-political process of overpowering, but also an innate ability in us, each one of us, to feel alienated by someone else or something else. And it's interesting that the experience of alienation also affects our cognitive and emotive capacities. So there is an effacement which is experienced as a result of alienation. And such an effacement forced us to think that we are unable to distinguish between the real and the ideal. So what was happening in the current situation and what is holding us for the future became less and less clear. We don't distinguish clearly between the actual and the imaginary. What is the actual situation and what is that which we are imagining? And also, very interestingly, our likes and dislikes also become homogeneous. Otherwise, we are people who have strong likes and dislikes. But once the cognitive and emotive effacement happens, we no more tend to have strong likes and dislikes. Why not strong likes and dislikes? Not even strong, not even a sense of like and dislike, because either way it is okay. We also make such phrases in life, right? Either way it is okay. I don't have any preferences. This is okay, that is okay. Perhaps in a day-to-day life, when things are all okay, such a distinction or such a reaction from us is okay. But in the context of alienation, when we lose in touch with our own likes and dislikes, it affects our ability to know what is outside and also to feel for oneself and for the other. As a result of a neutrality, because many people say that, oh, I don't have interest in this or that, I'm a very neutral person. And people think this neutrality is a very, very transcendental phenomenon or very highly spiritually evolved attitude. Many people think that to be neutral is what is to be ideal spiritually. I have a different view about it. If at all we are talking about transcendence, if at all we are talking about a higher dimension of our own self, it is about supreme sensitivity. It is about supreme sensitivity with our sensory content, with the relations with the other people, and with what is around us. I don't think there can be a heightened state of our own consciousness where we do not know what is happening around us. We do not know what is around us. So a neutrality, while a sense of neutrality, while it has its own perhaps advantages by helping us not to take stands and by helping us to sit on the edge all the time. So either this way you can fall or that way fall, and you look at how the breeze is going, and according to the movement of the breeze, you fall this way or that way. But of course, neutrality as that way, in that sense, it gives you a few strategies to deal with people and, decision making, etc. But neutrality, which is caused by lack of empathy, which is lack of connectedness, is very, very challenging. And it's amazing that a sense of neutrality is connected also with lack of empathy. And empathy is the ability to feel for the other by feeling for oneself. By knowing oneself, you know the other. And very interestingly, in the phenomenon of alienation, we also have certain cognitive difficulties. And these difficulties are expressed in terms of degree of analysis and integration. When a simple incident happens in our life, we are able to see the many parts of that incident, and we are also able to see the incident as a whole, right? I mean, I didn't want to give any simple examples, but when I say simple incident, it can be just planning for your day or planning for your future, not just for the day, which is 24 hours, but future maybe, which is a very, very long time. But in that whole process, whether it's a short-term planning or a long-term planning, we relate with parts, components, and then we also relate with a structure which holds these components together. And this is called as the ability to see the detail and the ability to see the whole. And the best seeing is the seeing of the detail and the whole at the same time. Not in a subsequent manner, but as a whole at the same time. So this is the ideal situation, what I just said, that ability to see the details and the whole, because they become very good leaders, they become good teachers, they become healers, because you don't see the forest without seeing the tree. You see the tree and the forest at the same time. It's not very easy. It's easily said, but it needs tremendous amount of self-effacement, some tremendous amount of sacrifice, and tremendous amount of a futuristic vision in order to see these two polarities together. So this is the ideal which I'm talking about. But in alienation, that sense or the ability to see the details and the ability to see the whole, each one of this decreases, and which is otherwise available, that immediate intuition to see the whole and the parts together, it gets disrupted, it gets crumbled. So people tend to see perhaps the whole, but not to the detail. And a few of us tend to see the details, but not the whole. But at any case, there's a disruption in connecting the whole and the detail in one framework. And as a result of this cognitive and emotional challenges, we gradually lose ourselves, and also we gradually lose the other. You not only lose yourself, but also you lose the other, who is your friend and who is your company at any point of time. Because in order to be an individual, you need a society. In order to be a person, you need a few more people around you. So COVID-19 also demonstrated to us that the loss of self also was the loss of the society. As a social structure, the framework, the fabric of society was affected. It was not just the mind of an individual or a few individuals were affected, but the mind, a mind of a larger entity called the society was affected. And of course, this degree of affecting the fabric was very different in different countries and according to different cultures. We don't go into that. So what I wanted to tell you is that it's a very negative story, which I've told you. I know that it's nothing positive there. It's all very bleak and very, very tragic. But then the last part of the tragedy is that there is a sense of meaninglessness in our life. You lose meaningless. You lose meaning in life. a sense of meaninglessness appear. But then the sense of meaningless becomes very overwhelming, and you tend to forget what has caused this meaninglessness. There was a huge narrative which brought in this meaninglessness. But then at that point, we are not capable of going back and analyzing what caused the meaninglessness, and we tend to stay in the state of meaninglessness. So this is the larger psychological scenario of alienation. But I don't want to stop there, because I personally, being an extremely positive person, I wish to think that alienation also has a positive side. Of course, I've spent quite a bit of time to explain to you, because I think by explaining, you also objectify it, and by objectifying it, you're also able to know yourself other than what you are talking about. And that is why we spend so much time in understanding what is alienation. Now, there is a negative and the positive side of alienation. The negative side, of course, in brief, is the disconnect and disengagement with oneself and the world outside, and the resulting cognitive, emotional detachment from things and people. What is the positive side? I think we being Indians, and I'm assuming in this audience whom I'm talking to, all of us are Indians, or at least we come from an Indian culture, even if we are sitting in other countries. We have heard about a different phenomenon, a twin of alienation. Alienation as a twin sibling. We hear about that sibling from our childhood, having born in a culture which is very old and which has layers of history and philosophy woven into it. And this sibling is called detachment. Indian philosophy, in fact, is the epitome of detachment. Anybody whom you meet who can be called as an Indian philosopher will talk to you about detachment. Whether he or she knows what is detachment is a different thing. What I want to say is that detachment apparently seems to be the highest ideal in Indian philosophy, right? You talk about, you think about Indian scriptures, Indian philosophical texts like the Gita or the Upanishads, or even the philosophies of other traditions, other darshana traditions. There is the goal of having to detach from your day-to-day life and then connect with the transcendence. So can a person be alienated and be detached at the same time? What I mean to say is, what are the positive sides of alienation? Or are we ready to look into it? Are we able to clearly distinguish between the psychologically challenging aspects of alienation and perhaps the spiritually or existentially enhancing aspects of alienation, which we see in the first chapter of the Gita, right? I mean, where you see the protagonist undergoing a very, very difficult situation of being alienated from his family, from his society, and finally from himself, and he falls down. He's supposed to be a very smart guy, but at that point of action, he falls down and not able to engage with what he was supposed to do. So, and many people talk about Arjuna's disinterest also as a sense of detachment. That's why we talk about Vishada as a yoga. Anyway, I mean, that's not the subject for today. But what I wanted to say is that detachment can be seen from a positive side as well. So what are the positive aspects of alienation in the form of detachment? So at that point, we don't call that as alienation, but we call that as a very refined and a sophisticated sense of detachment. And what does that sense of detachment entails with? A refined and a sophisticated sense of detachment, which is not hollow, which is not emptied of its content, which is the situation in alienation. Alienation, it is a discontentment and an emptiness and hollowness. But in a refined, sophisticated, layered detachment, there is much more content. And what is that content? That content is a very heightened sense of objectivity. The ability to objectify things using more refined forms of your awareness is accompanied with detachment. And that objectivity is not making something an object. No. Objectivity is the ability to see things as they are while not losing your own identity and your own self-structuredness. So you don't lose that receptacle in the process of receiving something, which is what happens in the phenomenon of alienation, that you don't have a receptacle to receive something. So there is no recipient, but there is only what is being given, which is the sense of overpowering. But here, the receptacle stays alive and clear, and there is also the ability to receive in terms of objectivity. And I think it's important to understand at this point, we are talking about detachment as an ability to distance oneself. Of course, this looks very familiar, similar. In alienation also there is distancing, right? Social isolation is of course social distancing, and we talk about social distancing now, right? These are some of the key words now we are talking about every day. At least once we say, please be distanced. We need to maintain a distance of 3 feet, 6 feet, 2 feet, or whatever. So at home also we say, please keep a distance. We forget that we are in the home, we are not outside. But distancing has become a very, very important keyword. But when we talk about detachment as a refined existential, spiritual, philosophical tool, distancing is the ability to see what is out there, at the same time maintaining the ability to see what is inside yourself. So it is the ability to see the self and the other in the most intact manner. So it's exactly the opposite of alienation, which happens in detachment. Detachment gives you the power to see the self and the other in a very neat and clean manner with its own borders tight. So there is a gain of subjectivity as well as the gain of objectivity in detachment. You don't lose yourself, unlike alienation, where finally it is the loss of self. But in detachment, there is a gain of self. There is self-development than self-exhaustion or self-loss. You gain a self. Your self is developed. And as a result of developed self-development and as a result of subjectivity, which is gained, you also have a sense of objectivity. Objectivity is the ability to see things without getting overpowered by what you see. Because in alienation, you get overpowered by what comes in front of you. Here in detachment, you don't get overpowered, but you're able to see things as they are because you are able to keep oneself as we are. Now, I think it is very important that we distinguish between alienation and detachment. And alienation doesn't have a sibling in the Western culture. We don't talk about alienation in any positive manner in the Western culture. But I think coming from a culture which is much more older, much more layered, like the South Asian or Indian culture, I think it's important we see the other side of alienation. And we need to see where the negative part of alienation stops and the positive part of detachment starts. But then I think it is up to ourselves not to be confusing between the two. And it's up to ourselves to be honest enough to discover which part of or which sibling we are following of alienation or detachment. I want to stop for a minute this discussion with two stories. Because without stories, our life narratives are never complete, right? And these two stories, one story is from the Greek philosophy. And I'm sure you all know the hero of the story. And we also have forms of that hero in our own culture. And the hero is Sisyphus. Have you heard of that hero called Sisyphus? And most of Indian culture, the vernacular communities, also have a story similar to Sisyphus. I come from Kerala, and in Kerala also we have the Kerala mythologies also have a story similar to Sisyphus, but I don't want to go into that. But let's talk about the story of Sisyphus. Sisyphus apparently was a king, a mighty king, very smart, and at some point he became too smart. So whenever he becomes an ordinary person, or a king becomes too smart, the king of kings become also very jealous. So in this context, Zeus become very jealous of Sisyphus. You know that Zeus, I guess the right pronunciation, Zeus. Zeus become very jealous of Sisyphus, and Sisyphus is condemned or punished to go into the nether world. And not only he goes to the nether world, he's a king, but he goes to the nether world and he has to lead a life of continuous hopelessness. And it is this continuous life of hopelessness which is demonstrated by rolling this huge cauldron, the huge stone, up above the hill. And before you reach the hill, the stone comes down. And again, he has to go down and roll the stone up. So it's very interesting that in a sense, you can say that Sisyphus' eternal journey, the return of the eternity, which of course is a very, very important point of discussion in Nietzsche and others, where they talk about the return of the eternity, the continuous cycle of eternity returning and again. It's discussed in very detailed manner, but we don't go into it. But what we see in Sisyphus is the eternity for hopelessness. Hopelessness as an eternal phenomenon, continuing, coming from frustration and of eternal repetition. So it's a repetition of having to roll this big stone up, and the repetition of it's falling down and again going up, and frustration leading to hopelessness, but still continuing the work as usual. So Sisyphus, in that sense, perhaps you can say that is an epitome of alienation. Alienation from what you are doing. Every time you take the stone up, you see it fall down, but still you don't think you have to stop doing that and maybe perhaps do something else. No, you still want to roll that stone up because you have a disconnect between yourself and the activity which you do and the outcome of it. You have experienced the outcome of the stone falling down in just maybe last 1 hour. But still you forget that outcome and you still start doing it. Means there's an extreme disconnect between your actions, your outcomes, and your ability to see your action and outcome as a whole. But let us also talk about another hero. So I would like to think of this Sisyphus as the epitome or a hero of alienation in its highest degree of hopelessness and frustration. I want to also talk about a hero of detachment. And the name which often comes to my mind is the young boy called Nachiketas. And one of the Upanishads talks about this boy, Nachiketas. And it's very interesting to know his story as well. Very briefly, Nachiketas' father is very interested in performing rituals. You know, I mean, he's supposed to be a very rational person, but at the evening of his day, he also performs rituals, like some of us, right? We are very rational during the daytime, but in the evening, we want to go to the puja room and say, whatever I said very rationally, and if I did something wrong, please pardon me. So we deal with this kind of very bifurcated personality in ourselves. So Vajasravas, the father of Nachiketas, was such a person. So by evening of the day, or at some point in his life, he gets this feeling of having to do social service. So he does the social service, he gives away a lot of things. And what does Nachiketas see? Nachiketas see that his father is giving away cows which cannot be milked even for one more time. So the cows which have given the last drop of milk, cows which have eaten the last blade of grass, hardly can move. So pathetic things were being given by his father. And Nachiketas has an innocent mind and as a mind who is curious. He feels that this is not true, and he asks his father, "What are you doing? Why are you doing this? Are you supposed to do this?" And the father disregards all his queries, and but Nachiketas continuously pesters his father with a question, and father finally says, "You go to hell." Just like Sisyphus was sent to hell by Zeus, Nachiketas also was sent to hell, but in our hell is supposed to be ruled by a person called Yama, the god of death. So before going to hell or heaven, you have to go to his world. So Nachiketas go to the world of Yama, and very interestingly, again, he has to wait there for 2 days because Yama was there. Once Yama comes, Yama feels very bad that his guest had to wait. So Yama says that you can ask me a few boons. I'm going to give you a few the desires you have. Nachiketas asks for 2 things. One is he wants to know what exists after death. That's one question which Nachiketas asks. What exists after death? And the other question he asks is, what can I do for the well-being of my society? It's very interesting that these 2 questions were asked by Nachiketas. Nachiketas also meets death. He also meets hopelessness. He also sees the hopelessness and the bleak way of living by his father. But something else happens to Nachiketas. He becomes detached, and detachment allows us to ask questions in a very different manner. And I think these are 2 examples which are very stark. We can perhaps look at as 2 possibilities of understanding alienation and detachment, because these 2 are completely different. While one leads to more self-discovery by taking very, very difficult experiments, and it is a lot of challenges are there in that. In detachment also, there's a lot of challenge. It's not that it just comes just like that. It's like a walking on the razor's edge. The same Upanishad talks about walking on the razor's edge. So, but detachment is a very powerful tool for us to develop our cognitive skills, emotive skills, and also to be a person capable of being sensitive to the other. But alienation is the opposite of that. It leads to more hopelessness, frustration, distrust, and also disowning of oneself. So I think it's very important to see the binary of alienation also in the context of our culture, in the context of perhaps the life of each one of us. How do we understand the forces of alienation? Are we able to transform the forces of alienation, perhaps, which are lingering around us, to forces of generating a degree of detachment in us, which allows us to perhaps refine our personality, helps us to refine our relationship with our environment, with the family, and with the people around us. Thank you very much. So I see a lot of questions or comments in the chat. Perhaps Niharika can ask, or can you moderate, Niharika?
Yeah, there are 2 questions. May I request you to please unmute yourself and please speak out the questions?
I have one question. Thank you for that very interesting journey. One sees estrangement and the disconnected state of being. But what I would like to ask is there a conscious or a volitional process that leads to this estrangement? Or how does that happen? Yes, one finds oneself there, but we often say one disowns oneself, or one finds oneself estranged. Is that a volitional act? If somebody else is disowning me or estranging me, that is visible and clear. But within oneself, is that a volitional act, or how does that happen?
Well, nobody wants to give up oneself, right? Thank you, sir, for that question. Well, no one wants to disown oneself, right? I guess that's the simple intuition. Nobody wants to give up oneself. You may give up another person, but you don't want to give up oneself. But I guess the irony of a self-disowning is that perhaps, as you said, we do not do it in a very systematic manner of disowning oneself, but it happens as a cumulative effect of our way of life, our way of looking at things, our way of responding to situations, our way of relating with other people. So it's a cumulative effect which comes and looks at us in a very powerful manner at some point in our life.
And this is Nuzit. So the question that I have is, like, in some instance, is it possible that the neutrality also results into sensitivity and empathy? because in some situation where you are neutral to some aspects of your life, you are sensitive to others and you are empathic to others. So when we had a conversation, you just said that neutrality usually takes away that empathy or sensitivity. So is it possible that neutrality in some situations can also lead to sensitivity and empathy in other situations?
Well, I think we discussed about it, and if you would remember, we talked about neutrality as having the capacity to lead to more refinements of our mind. At the same time, can also present ourselves as a very bland and spiceless person. So, but I think your question perhaps gets clarified and understood if we contextualize it in the context of alienation and detachment. Neutrality, if it is supported by a detached sense, then it gives to empathy, then it gives to much more ability to see things together. But if it is in the context of alienation, then neutrality only takes us away from the other person. It doesn't help us. So I think it gives you completely two different pictures when neutrality is seen in the context of alienation and neutrality in the context of detachment. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. This is Jamil. I'm from Kashmir, and I have a question like, can we relate the condition of abjection or abject as put forth by some psychoanalysts to the sense of alienation? And what are the various nuances of being alienated? Like, can it be fractured into economic alienation, political alienation, social alienation, or religious alienation, or as we see the contemporary happening into something which is called biomedical alienation? And don't we see that all these forms of alienation which arise due to a sort of fear or abjection finally give us an option to resist or prove our resistance?
Yeah, I think I agree with you that alienation is a multifaceted process. It is a process and it is multifaceted as well. Process because it goes through a historical time of social forces, psychosocial forces, and it is multifaceted because there are several components which are contributing to the experience of alienation. And there are also discussion whether the society is alienated from the self or the self is alienated from the society. Because when no more the society can feel the pangs of the individual, then the society is alienated from the individual. So I feel we have to understand what we mean by alienation, what we experience as alienation from its own context. The socio-political processes definitely has a huge amount to talk about in the context of alienation. But then at the same time, alienation is also a very psychologically strong entity which you and I go through at some point of time in our life. I think both have to be looked at, or different aspects of alienation have to be looked at. Thank you, Dr. Jenny.
Okay, thank you very much, ma'am.
I see Somashekar sir raising his hand and Neha Agarwal raising her hand. So, yeah. So.
Yeah, good afternoon, madam.
Good afternoon.
Yesterday, I remember Dr. Naren saying, be a passive observer. And I wanted to ask this question to him, but for want of time, I had resolved this. And articulating my question from yesterday is this particular concept of being a passive observer. Your last element of in your session, detachment being a sibling of alienation. So being detached and being a passive observer and taking a cue from the Indian traditions like being a sthita prajna, all these three different concepts, although they look very similar and identical, but they carry different connotations altogether. In our common parlance, although we are from the Indian traditions, we don't tend to use the word being detached. On the contrary, the frequency or the tendency to use the word being alienated is more. And how are these three things make a difference, and how do we account for these three? Sthita Pragnata, being a passive observer, and being detached. Thanks.
Well, I feel the true ability or a good ability to observe is not a very passive situation. When you are able to, so what I mean to say is there cannot be a passive observer. Observers will always be active, in a sense of not in a superficial manner. If you really can observe something, I think it's very easy to become settled. When we don't observe things, we become part of it, you become unsettled. So the whole idea of passive observer, perhaps it's an oxymoron, but what it is meant is to not be entangled by the content of our observation. Of course, these are all philosophical tools which we talk about in our culture, in our philosophy. So I think what you were asking is whether alienation and detachment both include passive observation, or passive observation leads to detachment. So when we say observation, I think observation again is the ability to observe something in a totality. If you don't observe in the totality, again it leads to neutrality. And again it makes you not an agent, but it makes you a product of overpowering forces. So it's very important to understand neutrality in the context of or observation in the context of engagement with it. Otherwise, it can be interpreted something which is of disinterest. Disinterest need not be detachment. I mean, you are just disinterested. But detachment, perhaps in the sense of what we discussed as an opposite of alienation, is not just disinterest, but it is an extreme sense of engagement with the other. Thank you.
Okay, can I ask one more point, madam? Yeah. You said this alienation is actually an outcome or resultant of socio-political forces and causes, and you gave many illustrations to explain that. But are there similar results out of socio-cultural compulsions? For instance, most of us in one or the other way during our lifetime, we would have experienced, at least in my personal and some of my friends kind of thing. I personally have already experienced this kind of estrangement or disowning by their own community or families and things like that. So that way, the so-called alienation is not something new to us. So looking at from a socio-cultural perspective, would aligning ourselves or accommodating ourselves to this new phenomenon called the alienation would be easy for us if we were to look at from socio-cultural angle?
Yeah, I think we need to perhaps understand what do we mean by socio-cultural, because when we talk about socio-political, that also involves culture. You talk about Marxian theory, it talks about a culture of people who have and people who do not have. And the whole process of industrialization, market forces, capitalism, in the context of Marxian theory, is also indicating a culture which developed of overpowering a particular community of people for perhaps maximizing the gains and outcomes. So I understand that today we are living in a phase of time where ideas about efficiency, outcomes, etc., itself being questioned. Because earlier we talked about being more efficient, but now we don't know whether that is the way our narrative should form. Because being efficient sometimes is also being surrounded by forces of patriarchy and sources of manipulation. So when we talk about socio-political forces, there definitely these are cultural elements which we are talking about, no doubt about it.
Okay. Thanks.
Can I go now?
Neha Agarwal wanted to
Yeah.
speak.
Thank you, ma'am. It was a very interesting lecture. Am I audible? Okay.
Yes.
So I had partly read the theory of alienation, Marx's theory of alienation. but it does not talks about the positive aspect of alienation. So it is a complementary information that was missing in Marx's theory, that alienation also has a positive aspect to it. I was trying to relate it with the incidents that are happening, rise in cases during the pandemic, such as domestic abuse and suicides. And I was trying to link with both the aspects of alienation, positive and negative, with these. So I was thinking if we can say that generally alienation would also have to offer positive aspects to people, but for people who are already vulnerable, mentally, emotionally, who don't have access to the emotional resources or psychosocial support system, they are not able to be detached and see things objectively and see the whole and part, the gestalt perception. They are unable to do that. But they can only, their self got even more divided during this because of lack of social support system and resources. So if you have anything to add on that.
Well, I think I perhaps agree with you, and I think you have clearly articulated. So I think I'll not comment on that.
Yeah.
Sindhu Shri had a question.
Yes, am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay. First, thank you, ma'am, for sharing your views on this topic. When I sat down for the lecture, the first thought of alienating myself or oneself was the opposite view. I thought, because we are so used to being busy, we were so used to being told, the media telling us or your peers telling you what they think or what they read or what they saw. We were so used to being given opinions and had so less time to even understand what we are, what our personality is, what our views are. I thought this lockdown, or this isolating oneself, kind of gave us the time to actually process our own thoughts, process the demons that we were hiding away from, because we sometimes also keep ourselves busy to not have to face those thoughts. I thought this alienating was before the quarantine, before where we would just metaphorically alienating ourselves from our thoughts. When the isolation happened, that barrier, at least with oneself, came down. I don't know if it was similar to what you were saying, or if it was the opposite of what you were saying.
Well, I think it's important we see alienation from two different sides of the coin. And though there is a positive side of that coin, and perhaps what you experienced was from the positive side of it. And I think there were several people who experienced the positive side of that coin, of the ability to see something in a much more intimate manner, which you didn't earlier, and to feel more connected, to feel more alive. So that was also happening. So that is why I think it's important to understand the other side of alienation as well. So yes, I agree with you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Ma'am, in the chat, there are 3 questions.
Okay.
First is by Saurabh, sir. Compliments for an extremely lucid explanation of a phenomenon that, as you said, we all go through or have gone through at some point of time, especially the distinction between the seamlessly similar state of detachment, which is actually something quite different, as you brought out. What would you say is the role of rationality in breeding or giving rise to alienation?
Is Saurabh there, or is he there?
Ma'am, it's Saurabh, sir.
Okay, is he there, or?
Yeah, I think he's
there.
Yeah, thank you. Can you?
I don't see him.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, it is you who asked? Okay, I thought it was Dr. Saurabh Todaria.
Yeah.
Oh, it's Ambassador.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, because I have another colleague by the same name, Saurabh. His name is. So rationality, well, I don't know. I mean, we talked a little bit about objectivity and subjectivity. Our ability to be objective and subjective. In the sense, because if you take being rational as a very privileged state of existence, that also has its own problems. Because to be rational is not to be giving up our way of knowing through emotions and feelings, if that is what we meant by rationality. But if we meant by rationality as a process of objectification, as an ability to see things together, to see things as they are and to see ourselves as what we are, definitely then that helps perhaps to understand the situation in a much more cohesive manner. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think there is a question from Meera, I see below, if she's here.
Yeah.
Related. And
With that? Yes, please.
From
Yes.
Sangeetha menon, ma'am.
It's related, and I would also be interested in that.
What is Meera's question?
Let her put it to
Yes.
please on the chat, Meera.
Yeah, I'm here, ma'am. Yeah, I'm here, ma'am.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I see.
Yeah. Yeah, ma'am, my question was, is the difference between alienation and detachment, is it a matter of perspective? Like if you change your perspective, is it possible that alienation will somehow magically convert to, say, a power of detachment? Is it possible to do that? Or are they thoroughly different processes?
Well, I agree with you, Meera, because a perspective has a lot to do with it. So if you change a perspective, you see ourselves in a completely different light. But then the irony of our life is that perspectives alone are not enough. Perspectives have to be solidified. Perspectives have to be grounded in a long-term standpoint as well, which means we start living according to the perspective. Because otherwise perspective become a glass which has very good lenses, but which we don't use to see. We keep that glass spectacle in our spectacle box and we say, I have a very good glass and it can see things very clearly, but you forget to wear it. So perspective is good enough to start with, but then the perspective has to be grounded as well in our daily living, in our actualizing that perspective in our experience. So I agree with you. Definitely a perspective makes a change, but then perspective not just as a particular ideology, but as an attitude to life, as a way of living. Thank you.
Ma'am, can we take some more questions, ma'am?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, there's one question by faculty Guru Pyari Bhatnagar, if I'm pronouncing that right. Philosophical positions on alienations are visible in the West, as you said, can be seen in Hegel and Marx. Do we have such positions in Indian philosophy, also which are alienation specific and are not associated with detachment at all?
Is that person here around?
Yeah, hi ma'am. This is Gurpyari.
Yeah, hi. Hello.
Hi. So ma'am, my question is, generally, whenever we talk about, philosophies in Indian domain, so we generally, associate it with spirituality, or, we talk about the positions at a very high level. We don't relate it with, with the physical, we don't talk about it the physical level at all. We don't relate in terms of society, what's happening around us at all. So supposingly, if I have to talk about the current scenario, for instance, and I have to, bring in the philosophical positions from Indian domain only. So obviously, there, is a very important aspect that you have talked about, which is the concept of detachment. But do we have, such philosophical positions, which could be, the counterpart of, Hegel and Marx from the Indian domain?
I didn't quite get the last part of your question.
Supposedly, supposedly, if I have to talk about the current position, the current scenario about COVID-19, and I have to talk about, that in the context of, my society, my community? So can I depend on any philosophical position which can be the counterpart of, Hegel and Marx, which are, Indian philosophical positions?
Yeah, I think there are umpteen number of possibilities of looking at understanding alienation from other cultures as well. But I think the Marxian and Hegelian theory are very prominent and dominant, and it has its own values, because the outcomes of those forces we see in our culture and our society too. The forces of patriarchy, the forces of industrialization, the forces of alienation brought in by social reorganization, we see in our culture also. So I think the ideas which go back to Marxian and Hegelian philosophy are also ideas we see in multiple cultures, right? So that's not a problem. But I think the challenge is to perhaps understand, I think as I was trying to attempt, the sibling part of alienation. Do we have a sibling of alienation? Do we have the other side of alienation, which can be used as perhaps Dr. Sindhusri said, of developing yourself in the process? So here was this occasion for yourself to take back, to sit back and take a look forward. So I think most of Indian philosophies talk about it, but the problem with most of the interpretations of Indian philosophical schools is a detachment which is not much interested in day-to-day life, or at least that's a misinterpretation about Indian philosophical idea about being detached. So it is detachment as giving up of the world, which definitely is argued by Western philosophies, particularly in the context of postmodernism or in context of other philosophers, continental philosophers. So I think it's very important to understand Indian philosophical tradition as a tradition which embraces our daily living and then catapulting to a space of transcendence. So it is not a transcendence which has given up our daily life, but it has a transcendence which we can experience in our daily life by connecting and also by detaching at the same time. So, but of course, we don't have time to talk about perhaps the specific concepts in Indian philosophical schools, but I'll be very happy to discuss with you later, or we can have a discussion on this subject altogether in a different occasion. Thank you.
Ma'am, there's one more question.
Who is that?
Yeah, please go ahead. Oh, I think.
Who is that? Amritavalli or?
Yeah.
Amritavalli, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Am I spotlighted? Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Of what alienation is, your expansion of that idea. So you mentioned.
I lost the first part of what you said.
Oh, I just thank you for your lecture. That was the first part. So I had a question about your definition of, loosely, definition of alienation, because you mentioned two things. You talked about the sense of overpowering, and you also mentioned a loss of familiarity or the lack of familiarity. So when you said overpowering, my question essentially is, how can you feel overpowered? And give you an example in the context of COVID-19, and the example that you gave about the driver who, reached out and took his mask at the last moment. It's not that he lost the choice to not wear the mask, right? He could have gone on without wearing the mask. The only difference is that choice of not wearing the mask now in this new normal situation of COVID comes with a cost of 500 rupees, comes with a fine. So when you say overpowering, isn't it more like I can go out, I can make the same decisions I made, before March. I can go ahead with the same actions, but the costs that come with those actions are different. The consequences and maybe the degree of benefit I get from doing the same action is different. So I don't have to feel helpless. It seems to me more like I have to recalibrate how much of energy goes into something, how much of resource I can attribute to certain actions and how much I can't. So in this context, when you spoke of familiarity also, isn't that what a loss of familiarity essentially is? Familiarity is when you expect this action to have a certain outcome, and you expect it to go a certain way. So you do that action and you expect the outer outcome to happen. But when the situation changes, and familiarity it's an illusion, right? You're not I'm not controlling what the costs and benefits of all my actions are. They will change with the times. I can't sit here and assume that my life is not going to change. It seems like something that is self-imposed. That it so happens that the situation changed, and instead of feeling overpowered, maybe this is a rational way of looking at it. You look at the cost and the benefit, and you can still make your choices. You just have to deal with the consequences that are now changed. So, what would you say about that? If you have anything to add.
Well, I think I definitely don't feel overpowered by you, so I don't want to give an answer to your question. So that means there's no overpowering there, right? I mean, keep the joke apart. Any idea of controlling the other, even by saying that to be healthy, you have to do this, is a sense of overpowering.
Okay.
You may be having the voice of the state or voice of the institution, which says that these are the guidelines to stay healthy. But let us understand that we have to believe that every individual is capable of deciding what he or she thinks is good for that person. Why would somebody else will have to tell you that this is good? Which means we are either undermining the ability of that person to judge, to decide, and to behave in a manner which he or she thinks is good for them. So of course, I do understand your point of view, but I think that example which I gave has to be restricted within that context. Any example which is taken out of context will become meaningless. So the idea of overpowering is a simple, the idea of the policeman which I talked about was a simple example to demonstrate the role of overpowering forces, which of course become in a very big and larger global levels when we talk about market forces and market economy and capitalization and so on. But I think the simple idea is that we all have to ask the question, are you and I capable of deciding what is good for oneself without the intervention of another person? Whether that person be the voice of a state or a medical system or whatever. And unless we all become awareful of what is good or bad for us from our own point of view, in our own field, I don't think that true sense of health happens. Because then it's always something which is imposition. Of course, imposition is good. When people are not able to think for oneself, imposition is good, and then they act on behalf of you. But where we are talking about alienation, where the agent resides in one's own self, there we have to talk about forces of overpowering. And any occasion where we undermine the possibility of the person to decide what is good or bad for oneself, there we are overpowered.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ma'am? Okay, there's
Yes.
one. So ma'am, thank you very much. But stating that overpowering happens in political, religious or other scenarios, I think it's very dominant structure of conversation and exercising control within the family also. In family structures, when parents overpower, or mother-in-laws, of different kind of setups, positions in families, when they start to overpower, and that's when everybody in the family has enmeshed relationships. Not that overpowering could be healthy. Sometimes a child is not capable of taking his own decisions, so hence the mother or the father takes them for him or her. But most of the times when children come for therapy or counseling, it's basically this overpowering in an unhealthy manner that triggers dysfunctional families and unhealthy patterns of behavior. So it's very much prominent in family systems also, and also needs to be dealt with.
Thank you so much. I do agree with you. And I think the challenge for all of us as educators or healers is to perhaps make that change without being a force of power, but being a force of awareness.
Awareness, yes. Very well said, ma'am. Without being the force of overpowers. Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Ma'am, can we take more questions?
Are they? I thought the questions are over. They are not
There's
over?
one more by Deepthi.
Deepthi. Okay. Who is that? Is she there? Is Deepthi here?
Yes, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes. First of all, thank you for the series of lectures that have been organized. I think for somebody who is unfamiliar with these concepts to begin with, or has experiential knowledge but doesn't have the theoretical framework to sort of organize that knowledge and recognize each part for what it is, this has been quite helpful from a personal point of view. My only question is, like I said, I do want to understand them in a manner which I think is a little is not possible in the format that we have a 1 hour session and then we discuss it. Coming from a place of not having really read about it a lot, can you please suggest a few resources or books that could help us understand the nuances, say for example, between isolation and detachment? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Deepthi. But you don't want me to do that for another 1 hour, right? I'll give you a customized session for references. Perhaps do an internship at NIAS, or maybe perhaps at another course. Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are done with mostly.
Oh, ma'am, there is one question. It's not addressed. It's called, can I read it out to you?
Yes, please.
It says, this question is by, I think, Saurav sir. It says, just a point of curiosity. Does Eric Form, admit to the possibility / desirability of development of a state of detachment in the course of progression in life towards maturity?
Thank you, Ambassador. I assume it is not Saurav Todari and it is Ambassador Saurav Kumar who said that?
Yes, it's Ambassador.
Yes, it is me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you want me to respond, or I think I almost agree with you?
Yeah, yes, thank you.
Sangeetha ma'am covered this question with Mira's question.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Now, I was very fond of Fromm at one time. I have not read him for a while, so that's why I asked you, where does that fit in his scheme of things?
All right.
Thank you.
Any other question, Niharika?
No, ma'am, for now.
Okay, then thank you very much. We meet next time. But please do email me your questions or your comments or your suggestions, your ideas. Email me or pass it on to Niharika. Otherwise, we'll meet next week for 3 other very interesting topics. And we will learn from each other. And I think as we discussed in the first meeting itself, this course is not just a teacher-student paradigm, but it is learning from each other, learning from each one of us by learning from another person. So learning itself becomes not an activity of binary, but learning becomes an activity of being. And I think that is very, very important when we are living in a world today of binaries. It's very important that we make these conscious efforts to go beyond the binaries and to exist as a collective. So thank you for helping us in that. So we will see all of you next week. Thank you very much, Niharika. Thank you all. Bye-bye.